Right, good morning, guys. My name's James White. I'm the managing director here at Media First. Um, Today, we're going to do things a little bit differently. I've actually got Andrea Booth, who is going to be hosting this webinar on behalf of Media First. Andrea is one of our senior account managers here. So she's really well placed to ask questions on behalf of you guys, because ultimately you guys are the people that she talks to every day. You are the guys who pick up the phone to her and go, Andrea, I've got this problem. I've got this communications problem, or we've got this spokesperson that we need to train. And this is, their character. This is who they are. This is what the challenge is. How can you help? What type of course can you design and develop to help that person? So that's Andrea's role, and we'll bring her on camera in a moment and have a chat to her. And she's going to be chatting to Kirsty Waite, who is one of our senior business coaches at Business Coaching Foundation, BCF Group. BCF Group is another business that I'm involved in that is, as the name suggests, it specializes in business coaching and management training. So they do accredited training and non-accredited training. So if that's something you'd like to learn more about, then just pop a question in the chat or get in touch with myself or your account manager or anybody at Media First, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction. So let's get Andrea on stage. And while she's on her way, I'll just flag up to you guys that we want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions, chuck it into the chat bar, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And even if you don't ask a question yourself, you can go on there, see the questions that other people are asking, and you can upvote them. And that literally means just giving it a thumbs up. It will move it up the chain of questions, and then I'll know that we can talk about that, and that's an important topic for you guys. So please do ask as many questions as you can, because that's really what makes these webinars. It's all about you guys. Andrea, welcome to the stage. You're sat in our studio.
And I'm colour matching, obviously.
You are. How does it feel to be in the hot seat?
Oh, fantastic. Looking forward to it. I'm just really pleased there's lots of people online, lots of people who I recognise. Some people may not know me from Adam, but I've hopefully spoken to a few of you. I know all your challenges pretty much. I'm not covering them off in what we talk about today, as James says, just ping a question in and we'll get to that. But I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation with Kirsty. She's fantastic.
So, Andrea, you've been, just a bit of background about yourself. You've been at Media First for how long this time around? Because you've been with the company twice, haven't you? Tell us the story. What happened?
My world is really in magazine production and publishing and catalogue production. So I've always sat in the marketing departments of companies, still under the marketing communications umbrella, sort of. So understanding customers' needs has still been a big part of my world. But I came to Media First many years ago, 2007, just as a sort of part-time job-ish when I had my first child. Absolutely fell in love with the place. Was a phone basher. Worked for some fantastic people, spoke to a lot of fantastic clients, got to know the journalists, got to know the trade. Went away again, actually, back into my original publishing world, but then got the opportunity to come back in 2015 with you, and I've not looked back. I've always loved Media First. I've always loved the ethics behind the business. I've loved designing courses. Just really enjoy helping clients to make the most of their spokespeople and their media engagement. So
it's the variety of people that we work with, isn't it? The people and their challenges and their businesses, and the different trainers as well. Makes it really interesting.
Absolutely. And so also delivering good training. This isn't a sales pitch. It never has been. But when I talk to clients and about their training needs, and we design a bespoke course for them that actually addresses exactly what they need, and they're worried that it's not going to, they've got senior people coming in, and you're sure it's going to be a right fit, you're sure they're going to get what they want out of it. And then afterwards, that feedback from my clients saying it was exactly what we needed. We've actually learned so much and more than we could ever have imagined. That is honestly the best job in the world.
Yeah. Right, so Kirsty, we're going to get Kirsty on stage. Before we do, shall I just give a quick intro into BCF? Conscious I didn't really say much about BCF Group at the start there, but BCF, ILM accredited training, so Institute of Leadership Management. Kirsty leads on our ILM 5 and our ILM 7 coaching courses. And Andrea, I'll leave you to take over and go from there. I'll jump back in if any questions come in that I think are really pertinent for you guys to be talking about at that moment. But I'm going to sit back and relax. So over to you, Andrea.
Thanks very much, James. I think, well, hello, everybody. I think probably, you know, as I said, I've sort of understand most of your challenges in terms of looking after your spokespeople before and after an interview, and how to best support them basically in their role to make your life easier. You know, it's very difficult to get spokespeople to even, you know, stand up and offer themselves as interviewees, but also to get the right interview. We've all been there in that hideous situation where, you know, you've got a new campaign, you've got a new product launch, you've got your interview set up with all your key journalists, you've written a fantastic brief, you've fingers crossed the CEO has read it, you take them to the interview, they do the interview, they don't land any of the key messages, unfortunately. In fact, the interview goes in completely the wrong direction. And worse, you've got to feed back to him afterwards or her afterwards to say that wasn't quite what we wanted there. And you've not got any ideas on how to make it better. And I think, you know, that's a really sort of cliched example of when an interview goes wrong. And I know that there's loads of different challenges you guys have got as well. So, you know, things like how do you make the time to give a proper briefing to somebody who's very senior and very busy? What about the different personalities that you're dealing with? You know, there's, you know, somebody might be really nervous. Somebody might be really overconfident, which is even worse. And they think they're fantastic at what they do, but there could be improvements. What you don't want to do is sort of lose that opportunity. And you really want to get the best out of the interview, but also develop the best relationship with your spokesperson and your spokespeople, so that it makes your life easier and you get the results you want. So I think today's going to be really interesting because although we'd obviously always suggest that you get media training for your spokespeople, make sure they're all up to date. And obviously we've got loads of information on our blogs about our usual sort of preparation techniques and how to write the perfect brief and how to give feedback. Check out our website for all of those. I think Kirsty's going to bring something really different to the party, a bit of a fresh perspective here. As James mentioned, BCF Group are an accredited business coaching and leadership management training company. And Kirsty's an accredited coach. And although you may have heard a little bit about coaching and sort of building a sort of coaching environment, we're not asking you to become trained coaches in this session. But what Kirsty's going to bring to this is a really fresh perspective as how you can apply those sort of coaching principles to your everyday role, and how that might make life better for you, might inspire you to make some changes in your processes, but it's certainly going to help you to think differently about how you support your spokespeople. So I'm going to ask Kirsty just to quickly introduce herself, and then I'm going to go on to the first question, which is, well, we're just going to have a chat, really. It's more about, we're going to look at briefing and preparing our spokespeople first. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Kirsty, and then give us some ideas, some tips, some advice on how, from your perspective, you can help the guys at home watching, or from the offices watching, how to best prepare their spokespeople before an event like an interview.
So thank you for having me, Andrea. And yeah, so just to build a little bit on what James has said. So I'm the coach and tutor for the BCF in supporting them deliver their ILM business coaching and mentor and leadership qualifications. Previous to that, I've spent the best part of 20 years in corporate, leading global teams, supporting people becoming their best. And what I did is I identified the bit of the role that I absolutely loved and I was super passionate about, and that is the people. Hence why we are here today, and I do that full time, supporting people and helping them be the best they can be using coaching. So to go on to your question, Andrea, so just to be really clear, what I'm bringing to the party and what I'm talking about is purely coaching, and coaching is very people focused and very people orientated, and it's getting the best out of your people. It's about empowering them, it's about looking forward, it's about supporting them to support the business. So I'm coming at it from that perspective. So the key things that I think, Andrea, are really key on the question that you asked is, I think it's about understanding behavioural types. It's been about people knowing who they're talking to, understanding what they need to do, and it's about the individual brief and the spokespeople creating a pathway for them, creating certainty and fairness in that process. And I think really key is open communication. So that's my initial key points on that.
So those are headlines, which I'm going to delve into a bit deeper now, because I think people watching might be sort of like, well, this is all coaching speak. I don't understand it. Or they might have a really good handle on coaching and have some experience of that, but might not really understand how that applies to this particular scenario of how you prepare people for something big, like an interview, or even a presentation, or if they're going to go to any sort of event and they need to deliver a key message, they need to get something across. So you mentioned behavioral style. So this is all, I could tell you millions of examples of clients that I have from, a large press team, quite junior media team, but there's very senior spokespeople that you have to brief. Some are really open to advice, some people aren't. Some people have the time to take a brief, some people don't. In the other direction, there's also, I work with a lot of charities, and the spokespeople are quite young because they're on the ground doing the hard work. And the press officers, the head of comms are quite senior. So again, it's, if those people are quite nervous, how can you adapt your style? So there's loads of examples there, I think. And also, I think maybe people respond better to different ways of briefing as well. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that, about behavioural style and how you adapt your approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an understanding the person you're delivering to, so the spokesperson, and understanding how to get the best out of them is really key at this stage and at this point. And it's about being prepared. So it's about knowing what kind of information the individual in front of you needs, how they receive information, how they operate, the kind of individual they are, and you being able to flex to suit those, because the whole purpose of the briefing is to prepare that spokesperson to allow them to get the best out of that interview. But they're only going to be able to do that if they go in with the right information. And to give them that information, it's the person that's briefing them's job to say, right, what does this individual need? How can I adapt and give them that? And that takes a bit of preparation. So it's about being prepared, organised, and also building relationships with who your spokespeople are. And I'm talking here from a process perspective of having time, understanding what you need to do ahead of the time, making sure that you're prepared. You've had those conversations, you've built up that profile, you know who these individuals are. Now, I do appreciate that people don't always have that huge run up in amount of time, but when we're talking from a coaching perspective, it is all about the people. It's understanding the people, it's understanding yourself. So it's being self-aware, it's about emotional intelligence and being able to flex that to suit the person in front of you.
So what you're sort of saying is that it's not like a one-size-fits-all briefing process, if you like. So, we've probably got people who are watching who just like, they have a standard template briefing document that they put together. It's got obviously the logistics of the day on it. It's got your overall aim. It's got your objective for the interview. It's got your key messages. It's got all your, anecdotal illustrations to support the message. It's got your anticipation of negative questions. It's got all that. It's all fully detailed, 3-page document. Probably too long, but we'll go on to that later. But actually, no, this is a good point to make now, isn't it? It's a standard template document. Send it to the spokesperson. They read it, and you expect to get, what you're saying is you shouldn't expect to get the same. You shouldn't brief people in the same way. Part of your job should be looking at your bank of spokespeople and building a profile for each of those spokespeople, and that should be part of your job, not just something you do the minute before the interview. It could be something that you start now.
Yeah.
And once you've developed that profile of that spokesperson and you understand, and that's part of this open communications that we'll go on to later, but you'll understand how they like to be briefed. Do they like loads of written notes? I mean, I love loads of written notes, so I can just literally absorb them all. But I know, you know, other people just prefer a couple of bullet points. Some people prefer to see a video. You know, how they receive information as well is different, and really build up, you know, get a spreadsheet of your individuals and just, you know, work out what do they want from me, not what do I want to tell them. It's more how do they receive information. Would that be right?
Absolutely. And I think what you say is, I think it's really important to have a process and a framework of, because there'll be certain bits of information that people need to know. So they need to know what their call to action is. They need to know the purpose. They need to know the objective. They need to know where they need to be, what time, how long. That information there is creating the pathway. It's creating the certainty. It's being fair. It's giving them that information. However, does that individual in front of you like to know the facts? Do they like to sit down and analyze what's going on? Do they like to sit down and read that 3-page brief? Or do they, like you mentioned, like the headlines, just give them the facts? But do they like to be told that? Do they like to talk about it? Or do they just like to be sent it? It's just building that profile up and understanding that individual's behavioral styles and how they perform at their best. Because if you've got someone that's sat in front of you and they are very controlling character and they work on, you know, results focus, they like to be in charge, they like to know what's happening, and you don't treat them like that, and you come in at it from a very supportive, laid back, oh yeah, they'll be fine, that's going to make that individual incredibly anxious and on edge and unprepared. So how can you give them what they need? And that it might be giving them all the information, giving them the written information, having a conversation. Is there anything else we need? Do you need anything else? Are you clear? Have you got agreed up expectations between the two of you? And it all goes back to understanding that person and building that relationship.
That's really interesting. I'm sure. I mean, I don't know if people watching actually take the time to do that, or whether they have the time to do that. But again, we'll go on to that later. You know, time pressures are a consideration. You said the next point you said was creating a pathway. You said creating fairness and certainty, and creating a pathway. So you've both got a shared goal. That really resonates with me, and will do with anybody who's done any of our media training. Having a shared aim of the interview. What are we trying to achieve here? What are we trying to achieve here? Not just you. It's not all on you. What are we trying to achieve? What's the objective of the interview? Are you trying to persuade somebody of a point? Are you trying to just raise profile of the organisation or a campaign? Are you trying to set the record straight? You know, is there a specific call to action? You want people to go to the website and start logging on to a certain website. So what is the overall aim of the interview? And then we have a really well tried and tested preparation technique for interviews, how to prepare for an interview, looking at who your audience is, what is your key message, building all the examples to support that message, and anticipating those negative questions. So that is your sort of almost like your pathway, your clear aim. This is what we want to get out of this interview. So that's obviously, as well as understanding the person, creating that fairness and certainty that you'll both have a shared aim. That's a really big part of it, isn't it?
It is. And you mentioned at the beginning there, Andrea, if this is you in this together, this is a team effort, and this is you supporting that individual to get the best out of that interview. This is not you going, here's a brief, get in front of a camera, see you in 3 minutes. This is us, you literally taking that individual through together and really listening to what that person needs, and listen to understand, and listen to make sure that you're in agreement and those expectations have been met. And to really it needs to be a partnership to that point, because when you mentioned in the intro there about people struggling to get people to be spokespeople, and I imagine if they understood the pathway, they understood what support they were going to get, they might be a little bit more eager to step into that role if they knew it was a fully supported role rather than a face to stand in front of a camera, if that makes sense.
That does actually. And that goes beyond just the briefing. That's actually create a pathway, create fairness, create certainty about what support they'll get from you. You know, it's not just a case of getting a brief. The actual what pathway you're creating for them or making them aware of is the whole process of being the spokesperson and what they'll get from you as a press officer or a head of comms or as even a marketing manager who's, you know, dealing with spokespeople. So that's sort of creating fairness and certainty, having a clear aim and making sure you're both aware of what the process is and how much you'll be involved in it, which is great. So they know that they're not on their own. And I think that sort of leads into your third point about open communications, which just is the real linchpin to all of this, isn't it? You know, we said sort of email somebody a brief or maybe have a quick call with them and say, listen, hope you've read the brief. This is what our aim is. There's much more to it, isn't there? Having those open conversations, even if you're a junior press minder and, you know, you're dealing with very senior people, it's all about creating that open conversation and having that open relationship and working together and, you know, knocking on the door and saying, listen, can we have this conversation? Because this is how it will help us to get the results.
Yeah, and it goes back to, it kind of overarches the last 2 points. It's all around building that relationship and having open communication. And even when you talk there about having a junior individual going to someone that's incredibly senior, it's taking a step back and going, okay, so how are we supporting this junior person who's briefing it? Are they going to have to go off and have quite courageous conversations because they're going to feel like, oh, I've got to go and speak to someone who's really senior? But what has the business done to support that individual to allow that to happen? But it's all about having regular communication. It's building the relationship. So the person who's briefing knows that this really senior person knows that they have 5 minutes. They have a 5-minute discussion. That's all they need, and that's kind of their routine. They have that process. They understand that's how they perform best. They can give them that information in that way. Or is it that the day before a briefing, they'll go and have a 30-minute discussion and they'll go through the briefing? And it's, again, building that relationship. But it does take sometimes some courageous conversation to build that. And
like you said, you've said from the beginning, it's not about you telling somebody what you need them to do. It's about you asking them, what do you want from me? And that actually is a really good way to start a conversation, to start that open communication, isn't it? You know, with all of your spokespeople. That brings in the behavioural style because it's kind of like, you know, it's you as a personality, what do you need from me? How do you like to be briefed? It's also sort of opening up making them aware of that pathway right at the beginning when you first sort of identify them as a spokesperson. It's those 3 things that you need to do, isn't it? Check out, you know, have a conversation with them to establish what their behavioural style is, bring them into that process and ask them how they want to be briefed. Explain the pathway. You know, this is how I'm going to support you and this is what we're trying to achieve. And you will always have that. You will always and it's always us in this together. It's not just, there you go, off you go. And overarching that is that open communications, which, although it might be, it's a challenge because there's, you know, as we said, everybody's time poor. Having the time to do that is challenging, and also having the opportunity to do that when the other person might not be available or might not have the inclination to do that. So it's kind of how would you sort of paint that picture of how you make that first approach?
I think what's really important to remember at this point of when we talking about using these coaching techniques, coaching is all about moving someone from their present state to a desired state. So that individual is probably senior, really talented individual. They have the knowledge and capacity to get in front of that camera and do a good interview. You as the briefing individual is just doing all you can to get the best out of them and to empower them to shine and create that magic. But to do that, we need to be prepared, and we need to these are the foundations that will allow that spokesperson to shine. And it's about this just being the process and the standard approach to how you do it.
I think James is going to come in with a
sorry guys, yeah, no, I was just coming on. I'm really enjoying this chat. I was just coming on because there's quite a few questions bouncing in here, and they're getting quite a few votes that I think is worth just picking up on some of these. So if you don't mind, I'll just drop some of these in, if that's all right, Andrea.
Yeah, go for it.
So Alania, I hope I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm 100% certain I'm getting it wrong. How do you tackle people who think they know what they're talking about but don't, and refuse a detailed brief? They are media trained, by the way, several times over. Just to add my bit to that, I guess, is I've often had people in the past say, I've got a team of media trained spokespeople, but they're unwilling to talk to journalists, or they're nervous about talking to journalists. And when you actually dig into the training they've received, it can sometimes be a fault of the training. It can sometimes be because they've, been hit over the head and told, look, it hurts when I interview you, and I'm a harsh journalist. I need to teach you how to handle bridging and things. So I guess my first thing would actually be to look at the quality of the media training they've received and just make sure it is right for those people. Because to me, that sounds like there's a problem there. They're not understanding the full process. But so if they're refusing to take a detailed brief, and it sounds like they're just not on message with what they need to be saying, Kirsty, what's your advice around how you address that with people?
I think the next point that I was going to mention to Andrea is about feedback and how we give that feedback and how we manage that. So if there is somebody that it's all around the feedback and the right individual giving that feedback and it being constructive. And if we have someone that's really junior trying to give that feedback, I think it's really important from a business perspective to say, is this individual qualified to give that feedback for this situation? What do they need to be doing differently, and how can we? It's a difficult conversation to have, and it is tricky, but it goes back to being really open and saying, okay, great, like what you said, James, we're comfortable that they've had the correct training, and they're still not listening, they're still not being on board. It's first of all going back to, okay, have started source, have we given them everything? Yes, we have. Then, okay, what was the expectations? What was the briefing like? What was that relationship and build up to that interview like? And then as part of that process, always make it really clear that there is a follow-up feedback session, and that could be supportive feedback, performance feedback, however you feel fit. But that feedback session needs to be structured in a way that is forward-looking to improve and get the best out of that person.
And I suppose it might also be something to do with, if they're a senior person, it could be that the feedback needs to come from one of their peers.
Yes.
It might just be, in this instance, we need one of their peers to give that feedback, or we need support from the rest of the business to be able to prove the feedback that we're saying, or we need to get an external consultant in or an external business coach to work with this person to go, look, this is it. Sometimes you just get stuck with that, don't you? And no matter, it could be one of those classic things of I've told them this 100 times, and then we come in and say it once and they go, oh yeah, of course.
But it goes back to, how does that individual learn, and how does that individual take information on? And it's looking at the whole piece surrounding it. It's not automatically assuming that that individual's being difficult. They could be coming at it from the intention that they're doing the right thing based on previous experience, training, conversation.
Or it could be that actually during the interview they just become nervous, and so they kind of lose track of it.
Yeah.
There was another question which ties nicely into that, I think, which is Michaela Gray. How do you approach coaching on tone? So this is potentially more of a kind of media training question, but for example, a chief exec who needs to talk to the people, they've got to connect, they've got to win hearts and minds, but they have a tone that suggests privilege, or who comes across as too clever for the interviewer. So they're just missing that tone of voice. Have you any advice on that?
I definitely think that's probably more of a question for you than me, but from a coaching perspective, it's around authenticity and genuine connection, and it's kind of being compassionate and empathetic in what your message is, and that's from my coaching perspective. But I'm sure you have a different view of it from training.
I think, Andrea, I've seen, in the past, that's a challenge that we're often asked to help with, isn't it? And one way that I've seen us solve that problem for people is by, obviously they have to have had some up-to-date media training that we're comfortable and confident in, but also we can do analysis and coaching directly off the back of their presentations and their training. So again, if we need to work alongside an internal team to help them to, get that message across and coach that person, then we can do that. But I think, that live feedback immediately after the event, potentially from a media trainer can really help with that.
Can I just add something else? Sorry, Andrea.
No, please do, Kirsty.
What I was going to say is self-awareness of that individual sometimes is part of the feedback process. If we mirror back to them what's the perception that's coming across on screen, they might not know that that's how they're coming across. And sometimes when someone isn't as self-aware, or they just maybe is nervous and not concentrating, once they've been made aware of it, it's like shining a spotlight on it so they can do something about it. But I think the initial step is being self-aware of it.
There's some great questions here. I'm going to hold back on some of them. I think what we might do with some of these questions, which are more kind of media training based, is we'll answer those separately, maybe after the event. But it's really interesting. I'm really looking forward to kind of the feedback bit. So Andrea, back to you, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. And if you see me pop on, then I'll be back to ask more. Take care, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions about reluctant spokespeople and how do you get people to do interviews when they don't want to do them, how to overcome nerves, how to make sure that they're hitting the right tone. I think in this first section, we were talking about preparation. Obviously, feedback is really key. It is about setting those shared goals, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's about working together to work out what is the outcome of this interview. What do you want the outcome to be? And if the outcome is to persuade and influence, or as our questioner asked, to hit a certain tone, are you being clear in your brief that that's the tone you're trying to achieve? And is it worth sort of, examining or explaining to the person who's given the interview, when you said it in this way, this is the tone that came across. Do you understand that that's what's happening? That's sort of we'll come on to that in a little bit, but it is all about setting shared goals and shared expectations, a shared pathway of what you're trying to achieve at the end, which is a massive part of our training. Preparing in the same way, understanding what the outcome of the interview is, and setting that pathway. But I think, let's go on to that leads really nicely into feedback. We did touch on it already. But if you're both aiming for the same thing, then surely the feedback should be a lot easier. So you've set your brief, you've set the aim of the interview, you've set the criteria that you need to hit. So you know that you want your spokespeople to recognise who the audience is. You know that you want them to understand that audience and speak directly to them. You both know that you want your spokesperson to get across one really important key message all the way through the interview. Keep illustrating that with loads of different messages. We know with examples, we know we want loads of human stories to bring it alive. We know that we've already sat and gone through all the difficult questions that could come up, and we've worked out what our standpoint is on those, or whether we're going to bridge away from those questions and move on to safer ground. So we know what our responses to those negative questions are. We've done all of that prep. So surely then the feedback, once you've done all that, plus you've done all of your coaching elements, so you've had those open conversations, you've understood that the certain personality that you're working with, so you both agree that you've briefed him or her, them in the best way for them to actually land it. So everybody's feeling really confident at this point. They give the interview, then surely the feedback afterwards should be pretty straightforward, because you're just measuring against the set criteria that you set out at the beginning. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. do all the stuff we've already talked about, and it does make it a lot easier to deal with after. But I think what's really important to be clear about is feedback needs to be independent from any kind of coaching, because if you end a coaching conversation with some feedback, the whole supportive, empowering piece is just going to be forgotten. All that's going to be remembered is that difficult feedback conversation. And I think the feedback conversation doesn't have to be difficult. And I think, like you say, it's made a lot easier if you've done that preparation. I think how to start that conversation is always invite the individual to give their view on their performance, to identify any learnings from their perspective, to ask any questions, and then they coming to you. It's not a case of, and you also need to bear in mind, the objective of this is to help them learn and get better next time, and to address any issues or learnings and how they can move forward and how you can support them between now and the next one. So it's not a case of sitting down and pointing the finger, being really aggressive and ripping it apart and pulling it apart. It's about having that really honest conversation, because that person in front of you wants to perform better. They don't want to go in front of that camera and completely tank and do a horrific interview and come off and get a lot of grief about it. They want to go on and perform. They want to shine. They want to do well for themselves as well as the business. They want to get the message right. So it's not a case of sitting and telling them what they've done wrong. It's about having that really open, honest, could be difficult conversation. But I would say the first step of that is you can prepare them beforehand as part of the process that this will happen. It happens after every interview. It's not just them. It's because if they don't know that, they automatically might think, well, they don't do this for everyone. They obviously just doing it because I haven't done very well, or they're not happy with me. So it's a standard feedback session, and always invite them to start the conversation. Because then that forces them to reflect on their own performance. Because if they're not forced to do that, they potentially may not give it another thought until the next time they've done it, or unless they've done something really wrong, then they know they'll get someone telling them that they've done really wrong. So even if they've done really well, it's an opportunity to sit down and say, that worked really well. What we changed previously really benefited. And you've got to think of what the objective of the feedback is, and it's future facing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important, that what you said there is really interesting, that you build feedback is part of the whole briefing process. Make that clear right at the beginning when you're having those open conversations and you're laying out that pathway of what the whole giving an interview process looks like, what support they'll get right at the beginning, but also what support they'll get afterwards. And make sure that feedback, don't be afraid to have those conversations. Make sure the feedback is part of the process and it's a positive learning experience, isn't it? And I think asking them to critique it first is definitely what we'd support in all of our training. That's what we do. Anybody who's been on our training courses, we do one-to-one interviews. We also do interviews in small groups, and the first thing we actually give feedback straight away after the interview, but the first thing we do is say, how do you think that went? And that's really interesting, because as you say, it gives people time to reflect on their own performance, and usually they're right. So they know exactly what they've done wrong, and the job then is to work out how you can then improve what you need from me as trainers, as well as, as press minders. What do you need from me as a trainer to help you move forward and achieve what we agreed you'd achieve? So I think that's what we do in our training. Right, you now need this little bit to help you nail it next time. So building that confidence you get, because nobody's going to get it right first time. There's always room for improvement. But like in our training courses, it's like a methodical approach. Giving that feedback, finding out what you need from me to get it better next time, and making sure that people have that next time. So I think that's really interesting. And again, as you said, it's not judging, it's about giving empathy, support, compassion, and it's all about thinking about the outcome, what the outcome is, and what the outcome was from that. I think as well, when do you give it? When do you give feedback? I mean, we give it straight after our interviews, but Is it sort of tailored to each personality? Or, there's certain scenarios you might only have one interview in the day, in which case you can probably give feedback at your leisure. But sometimes people have back-to-back interviews. When is the best time to give feedback, in your opinion?
I think as soon as you can, as soon as possible, because it's fresh in your mind. It's fresh in both of your minds, because when you first do something, you kind of go over it in your head and go over it of how it went, and having that conversation openly makes it a little bit easier than to dig back into like 2 weeks later. Just as soon as possible, I would say within the 24 to 48 hours of that. What's a really good point, just to build on what I mentioned when James was on, is earning the right to give performance feedback and being the right person to do that. And this all comes of looking back at yourself as the person briefing that individual of, did I support this individual the right way? Did I give them what they needed? Did I give them what they asked for a start? Then also, am I qualified to be given this feedback? Did I watch the interview? Did I do everything that I can? Because there's nothing worse than somebody trying to give feedback who's cobbling it together from other sources, or not really experienced in this process. They haven't, because that person in front of you is just not going to receive that feedback. All they're going to be sitting thinking is like, who are you to tell me this when you don't know any better? So it's making sure that the right people are given and supported during that feedback process.
I think as well, I mean, we often suggest to press officers, heads of comms, we work with comms teams a lot. It's often, you can ask the journalist afterwards for their feedback too. They're not necessarily going to tell you, if it's a print interview, what they're going to print, but that you can ask for the feedback from the journalist on the day, and sort of say, how do you feel that went? And that's actually quite valid feedback to give then to your spokesperson, because it's as you say, it's a qualified viewpoint as opposed to just an opinion. So, and I think that's really interesting.
And I think it's also really interesting, you've just triggered something, that when you're giving the feedback, it's not personal on their personality. It's not a personal attack on them. You need to focus on the outcome or the objective. It needs to be, it might be the way that they've spoken and come across in their tone. So it's focusing on the tone and what the perspective of that is coming across, rather than you as a person. It's like, it's you that's the problem. That's not what we're saying. It's like this behavior or this outcome, that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
And that goes back to the shared goals, doesn't it? You're in this together.
Yeah.
It's not just you on your own and then we critique you afterwards and look what you have or you haven't done.
Yeah.
It's about sort of working out between you what you've achieved against your set criteria. This is what we wanted to achieve. Have we achieved that? And if not, how can I help you to achieve that next time? And I think that's really important, isn't it? Just bringing in the partnership of it. And again, it goes right back to that open communications right from the very beginning, to sort of try and develop this relationship with all of your spokespeople, and it'd be a different relationship with each one. And it's going to take some time. And my question would be, which I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, I don't have time to do this. I get a request for an interview, I just need to get them up there. So what would you say to people who are just thinking, I just don't have the time to do this right now, or I might not have time to do it before an interview? You're saying,
I'd say
well in advance anyway, start it now.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. I think it doesn't have to wait for an interview to build those kind of relationships. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to be their best friend. It's understanding a professional relationship and a professional process. But equally, the spokesperson wants the best out of that interview. It's to help them, they need to give the time to the person giving them that information. So everyone wants the best out of it. So I'm sure that if people understand the purpose of what you're trying to achieve, it's a lot easier to try and get people's time. But equally, if you're happy with your process and you're happy with the outcome and you're happy with your interviews, that's fine. You don't need to do anything. But if you're doing the same thing every time and expecting a different result, you're going to be sadly mistaken. So if you want to improve your interviews, then you need to do something and you need to make it priority. And going back to what we said before, I think these things is just needs to become the norm process, and that's the kind of culture you create, and that's the kind of process you follow. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of time, you know.
Yeah, no, I agree. And this sort of coaching culture might be quite alien to a few people, especially in sort of some corporate environments, and they're thinking, how am I going to sort of inject this corporate culture? You know, that's not how we roll in our company. But there's nothing stopping you doing it as an individual and bringing that into your role. And hopefully, you know, it can sort of spread around the organization, and suddenly it is a way that something that you build into your process.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to understand how, when we talk about that process, Andrea, that you mentioned, of being prepared and how you train people, is that the norm? Is that kind of an average of what people do, or is it a case of they don't have a process, they just get a call for an interview and then they just then jump into action and do whatever it is they need to do? It'd be interesting to understand, because if that's their go-to, that last minute, what's the impact of having that? What's the outcome of that being your process?
No, I'm pretty sure that most people that I speak to, press officers, you know, comms teams, they have a process. It may not, the idea of having a one size fits all, not having a one size fits all, might be a little bit newer to people. And I think that's, you know, that I think everybody, you know, we've written a blog about how to write the perfect brief, you know. So what we didn't include in that is, you know, tailoring that, making sure you've got a profile for every single different personality that you're working with, and making sure that it's not a one size fits all brief. Some people like more information, some people like less, you know, understanding what they need from you as opposed to just thinking this is what I'm going to give you. And I think that's sort of the key points, isn't it?
And trying to understand that information, that different behavioural style, before the head of time. So as that individual's gone through their training, you could have some form of questionnaire or feedback or forum where you gather that information at that point, so you understand. So it doesn't have to be, I've got an interview tomorrow, I've got to pin these down, I've got to find out how they like it, I've got to understand their profile, because I can understand that being overwhelming. So it could be a case of, once you've identified your spokespeople and they go through that training, as part of that process, potentially, it could be getting to understand how they like information. So it could happen at a different stage.
And in all of our training, we always actively encourage the comms lead, the press officers, anybody who's supporting those spokespeople, we actively encourage them to come along to the training. And they can see firsthand the different personalities. They'll know them already, but they can see also from our trainers how they handle different people, because coaching is obviously very much like training. It's a different style, but our trainers obviously can pick out different personalities in the first few seconds of speaking to them, and they tailor their approach to each individual. So it's exact. And if you're watching that training, you can see how the trainer adapts their approach and adapts their style. Also, there's different levels of confidence. There's people who actively do not want to do an interview, and then there's people who are just absolutely up for it. You know, that's always part of the mix. By the end of it, everybody is happy to do an interview, and everybody has achieved the goal of improving. So the training element has been tailored to them to make sure that by the end of the process, they're happy to give an interview and they give a good interview. So that's really, if you're observing that, then that's going to give you a load of help in terms of building your profile, understanding each individual and how they respond to coaching. So I think that's really interesting. Hi, James.
Hello. We've got more questions.
Have we?
Yeah, we've got loads, actually. It's really good to see. So a couple here. Julia has asked, it'd be great to hear more about helping people overcome nerves. Is that something, Kirsty, you can talk about a little bit?
From a coaching perspective, obviously, for example, I've worked with people that have had a fear of talking, and it's just working with that individual to understand initially where that's coming from. Has something triggered that in the past? What are they thinking? What is it that's making them nervous? And just unpacking that a little bit. But that's not something that you can kind of do 10 minutes before an interview. It's about understanding what some people like to go into their own space, practice what they're going to say, need peace and quiet. Other people need to be distracted. So again, it's understanding when you're at that point of they're going to go into an interview and they're really nervous, what do they need to make them as calm as possible? But from a coaching perspective, which is a little bit deeper than what we're talking about today, it's understanding and unpacking where that's coming from.
Yeah. What about certainty and fairness? How does that fit into it?
So, fit into this conversation,
into kind of helping people to feel confident and comfortable in what it is that they've got to do.
Well, when you know the path, when you're being fair and giving them the pathway, showing them the journey. I know you hate that word, James, sorry. If you're being fair to them, you're creating that certainty of this is going to happen then. So setting them up of going, this is what, even to the logistics of, you need to be here at this point. We're meeting at this point. We're having a run through at this point. You're going into there. It's going to be this long. This is the interview. This is where you're going to sit. This is the objective. This is it. Like being really, really clear and fair to what the expectations are and what that path looks like for them that day.
Yeah. So it's just how else can you support them so that you might not be able to solve their nervous disposition. You might not be able to address that for them. But can you remove some of the baggage around it?
Yeah.
Can you help them with some of the other stuff?
Yeah. Ask them what they need. Ask them what they want, because they know. And I think sometimes when people are nervous or got something big, we kind of flap a little bit of going, oh, what do I do? And you try and do what you think you want. But just be really calm and say, what can I do to help you in this position? And it might be, just don't talk to me. Or it might be, get me a glass of water. It might be, distract me.
Have a large vodka and Coke.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also asking in the moment, but it's asking outside of that situation. Asking when they've got a clear head and going, I've noticed you become nervous. How can we help you? How can we better support you in that? And it might be something that we can do, or it might be something that the business needs to offer, but let's just talk about that.
I've got a really good example of that as well, which is happening tomorrow. We have a training course coming up for one of my really, really lovely clients. And one of the candidates is really nervous about the training. So the client's asked me to talk to the candidate beforehand. And what I'll do, and I think the problem is, which is no fault of anybody else's, that she's possibly overthinking it. But more importantly, she doesn't understand exactly what the training is. We obviously give everybody as much information as we can about the training beforehand, but until this person can visualize exactly what her role is going to be, understands the support that she's going to get before the training and after the training, or before the interview and after the interview. So the support that our trainers give, which is very much like press minders, very much like comms teams, it's the same role. It's giving you time to prepare, making sure you know what your aim is, making sure you know what your objective is, making sure you can manage difficult questions, which is everybody's nervous point. It's like, what will I do if I get asked a difficult question? We'll give you the tools to deal with that. We'll also go through those questions beforehand, so you can pretty much anticipate what they're going to be and what you need to do to either what your standpoint is or what you need to do to get away from that question, which is that thing up your sleeve that will give you all the confidence in the world. So we give everybody, we prepare with them, we get them to anticipate all the negative questions. They know exactly what their aim is. And then we do an interview, and then we feed back to you, and then we tell you, this was great, but just try this next time. That's exactly the same process as the press minders should be going through as well when they're training. And I'm going to speak to the candidate tomorrow and explain to her exactly that process of what our training looks like. And that's going to make her feel like, well, I can do that.
Because that's giving her the certainty, isn't it? You're laying that pathway out for her to say, this is what's going to happen. Because when people are nervous, it's because like what you say, Andrew, they're overthinking it because they don't know. They don't know what it is, so they're making it up in their head. And you know yourself, like, you get stuck in that thought cycle, and then all of a sudden it becomes this huge thing. When really, if you can just remove that and say step 1, 2, 3, 4, that's what you're doing. It's like, okay, that's fine, I get it. Yeah, but equally, it could be that they're just nervous, but the more they do it, they're fine. Do you know? It's just sometimes people got to go through it.
And also it might just be that they just, that nerves is figuring out how to harness those nerves and turn that nervousness into confidence and
into energy.
There needs to be a healthy amount of nerves. I think it's important. Certainly when you're talking to journalists, just to keep you keep you switched on. Who was it? I think, I can't remember who it was now. I think it was Steve Jobs or someone who used to say he used to go into meetings always needing the toilet because it kept him on edge, just that little bit on edge, so that he could,
yeah. You're in the room, you're present, aren't you?
yeah. Verity, question here from Verity: what is the best way of giving feedback that won't make them feel even more nervous next time? So, if you do have someone who's nervous, or let's even say they're non-nervous, but you've got to provide some feedback to them because, there's some, whether it's their messaging or the way they delivered the message, how can you give that without kind of, making them nervous the next time round, basically?
But just what I said to Andrew before, always ask them to give the feedback first on assessing their own performance, because more than likely they're going to come up and say, oh, I felt like, because I was really nervous that happened. And then that builds a conversation of, okay, how can we support you to not be that next time? Or if they don't mention it, it's just being really open and honest and saying, I noticed this, or what do you think about that? What do you, ask, and it being you've got to be open, because if we're not, it's at the detriment of the person in front of us, because we're not being true to them, we're not being honest, and they are never going to improve if we don't support them to improve. And part of that improvement is having open conversation.
Completely. Sarah O'Donnell, what's the best way of giving feedback to a senior person that can help them build their confidence? They're talking about steering conversations and keep people to timing and things like that. But it's a similar thing, isn't it, really? There must be an element, Kirsty, of, there's the whole classic, isn't it? That feedback sandwich, which you're shaking your head, and I knew you would, which is great. But talk to me about the feedback sandwich, because how do you deal with it in one conversation? You've got, right, I've got 5 good points and I've got 5 areas for improvement, let's say. How do you position that so that you're not just giving a feedback sandwich,
Ask people what they want, where they want to begin. Just say, once they've given their own performance, feedback on their own performance, just say, just to build on that, I've got a couple of points. Where do you want to start? What do you want first? The feedback sandwich I find incredibly patronising, because if you sat there going, oh, you're really, really great, all people are sitting and listening for is the but, and that's all they remember. Then here comes the next bit of fluff to, end it. It's like, just be really open, be transparent, and let them guide the conversation. And it's about, as well, adult thinking of, like, we all adults, allow ourselves to think and act like adults, Oh
my God, I'm so going to stop using the feedback sandwich now.
There's a
I
really
do
good
my
blog.
kids all the time.
There's a really good blog on the BCF website about the feedback sandwich. Worth a read.
But that is really interesting, isn't it? Just say, look, let me know what you thought. I've got some really good points to talk about and some areas that we can improve. What do you want to hear first? It's almost like good news or bad news, They're in control of the conversation then, aren't they? Mm-hmm. It's not you saying, right, I'm going to tell you X, Y, and Z. It's like, right, we need to talk about this. How do you want us to talk about this? It's giving, and that really works for senior people as well, because giving them the control of the conversation gives them the authority.
Yeah.
So you're not undermining them in any way. You're basically saying to me, right, how do you want this conversation to go? And I will follow how you want this conversation to go.
Yeah, you're getting permission, aren't you?
Yeah. And that's removes that fear of having to deal with a senior person and tell them that they've done something really wrong, if they are in control, it flows a lot easier.
Yeah,
no, that's a really good point. Julia's asked, how do you spot red flags? So bluff, bravado, brushing off, etc., that might mean someone is worrying inside but feigning confidence. Because as a coach, you must come across stuff like that all the time, where someone is literally, I'm this one person I need to be this strong, alpha, but in reality they, are a little schoolboy.
In coaching, vulnerability is really, really important. And I think in business, vulnerability is important, but it's always seen as a weakness. And I think building that relationship so they trust the individual in front of you. We're not asking them to go on camera and be that person, but to be open to the person briefing them, then you can support them. So in coaching, when that happens, it's about remaining very honest and open with the individual in front of me, and I can see through that. So I don't play along with that. It's been just calling it out, but that's a very different role to the person briefing that they're in. But it's from a briefing role perspective, it's about building the relationship and just asking, are you okay? I just asking the question, just being open. And I would say, depending on who is in the relationship, and don't be afraid to call it out if you think it's going to be at the detriment of the interview. But I think be careful with that. Be careful with that. Yeah.
Can I just read out Jamie Pikes? Hi, Jamie. We know Jamie really well. And I think this is down the same lines. You know, we often, as Jamie mentions, you have people who do great in training and are fantastic presenting to small groups and internally. But as Jamie said, if suddenly you put them in front of a camera and they try to be somebody else, they seem to get hung up on how they speak and their pronunciation. So their delivery becomes stilted and unnatural, and then they don't take the feedback well. You'd say to Jamie a similar thing, be open and honest about that. But in our training, we record and play back. And I think is that an element that you would include into your feedback, Kirsty? Sort of sometimes recording and going through the interview in playback and sort of say, is that how you wanted to come across? I mean, we do that in our training anyway, but is that something you'd sort of build in? Would that be a good answer for Jamie, or would you go down a different route?
I think it is about being open and honest, but I'm thinking of like the underneath of what's the difference from this situation to this situation, because something's happened in that person's mind to what they're saying and what they're doing. But is that because all of a sudden they're in front of a camera and their thoughts are very different? So in front of a small group, they might be really comfortable, they know the people, they feel relaxed. All of a sudden, when they sat in front of a camera, they're thinking of someone sat at home who they know they don't like and is going to be really judged. And then all of a sudden they this whole thought process changes, which changes you and how you present and who you are. Whereas I would be asking more about, okay, so what's changed from here to here? What do you need to be this person in front of the camera?
Yeah, to me that question from Jamie sounds a little bit like he's basically saying in media training the person is very confident and capable, but when they go back to the workplace they become quite stilted and nervous. And to me, assuming that he's talking about in our media training, which I like to think is very realistic, it probably means that they benefit from the coaching and the feedback that they're getting before their interviews. And they that support that they've got, that kind of wraparound support they've got during the media training. But I think Kirsty's point would be, and the point that Andrew has been making is talk to the person and ask them how we can help, to take them from this person to this person. They need to be the same person.
And it's that long process again, isn't it? It's, as James said, the sort of, in our training, it's a long process, not a long process, but it's a process to get to the interview. So don't expect your spokespeople to do it quicker than they would in media training. I would say, I mean, obviously you get quicker. But if people are nervous and they're unsure, then use the time that we spend in the media training, spend time preparing with them, spend time working out, what they need. Make sure they understand the aims. Make sure you've covered all the bases on the difficult questions, because that really is the place where people worry. And make sure they know that you're supporting them and you will support them all the way through that process. And then you'll get that feedback afterwards. I love the idea of it being a much longer process than just a brief.
Right, guys, just one quick comment here from Hugo. By the way, Andrea, Jamie says hello. Hugo says, I love the idea I've heard which relates to arguments in a relationship. It applies here too. It's not a me v you problem, but rather us v the problem.
Yeah.
So working on it together, which I think is a
so
lovely way
true.
of wrapping up the question.
Yeah.
There are more questions there. We will answer those. Keep an eye out on our blogs because we've probably answered quite a few of those via blogs. But Andrea, I'm going to hand back to you and say goodbye. Thank you very much for all the questions.
Thanks, James.
I think that's it. I mean, we could talk all day, but we've been told we can't. So listen, thank you so much for that. I mean, is there anything you want to add? I keep sort of summarizing all your amazing work and sort of, you know, sort of explaining in my own words all the fantastic work you do in terms of coaching. Is there anything you want to add, Kirsty, just to people who are watching, who are in those roles, just to sort of sum up what we've been talking about?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything. And I think that as a parting word, I would just say exactly what Jim said. It's about us. It's not about an individual, but it's all about the people. It's building relationships, it's creating connections, and it's getting them to be the best they can be. It's empowering the people. That's what it's about.
Fantastic. I think that's it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me, Andrea.
Thank you. Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. And thanks, James, for asking me. As an aside note, I was nervous about doing this, and then James found a way to. He understands my behavioural style. Found a way to persuade me to do it, and I think that's and I'm glad I did. Had all the support I wanted, so that's a case in point, isn't it?
Thanks, Andrea. I don't know if it's appropriate to let people know that you're drunk right now, though. She's not. I promise you, she's not. She's just naturally brilliant, and she doesn't quite know it sometimes. That's all. Kirsty, thanks ever so much. Andrea, well done. You've been brilliant. I'll give you some negative feedback in a moment, and then I'll tell you that you're brilliant again.
Please.
I won't. I've learned from everything Kirsty told me through this.
Me too.
Thank you to all of you guys for all the questions and for jumping in there. There have been loads that we didn't get to answer, so apologies for that. We're running another webinar. There's going to be a next webinar. Is going to be a BCF one. And we've also got another Media First webinar in the offing. I think it's going to be on sustainability, so it's going to be on a particular topic. And if you guys haven't already checked out the Media Team Academy, it's something that we're not really shouting from the rooftops about, but there is now a Media Team Academy, which is something that you can sign up to, that gives you access to 12 bespoke Media First masterclasses, which are a bit like this, but a bit more heavy on the training side, but also some coaching from Kirsty, some BCF coaching. And you also get access to our online training courses as well. You get 10 licenses of those online training courses. If you'd like to know more about that, it's a company subscription. It's for 8 of your media team members. It's called the Media Team Academy. Talk to the account managers, drop a question in the chat, complete it in the form, pick up the phone to us, send us smoke signals, whatever it is you want to do. And we will provide you with some more information. But for now, thank you very much, Kirsty. Thanks, Andrea. And thanks to all you lovely people out there.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.